Well, thank you all for being here this evening. It is wonderful to see all of you here. And it is a true pleasure and honor to be able to moderate and interview Seth Kaller, right? Kaller, thank you. I'm going to get it right, I promise. I keep wanting to, but there are so many people that may not know who you are. If for those who did not have the chance to Google you or YouTube you or look at the wonderful interview that you had previously with our board member, Sid Regal, and that closer look. By the way, that was a plug for those of you who hadn't had a chance to look at it. But if you could, just for our audience, let us know a little bit about who you are. You are the foremost expert of historical documents within the United States. How did you come to this profession?
Yeah, or at least documents of freedom, important documents of freedom. My family was in rare stamps and coins, so I was sort of an indentured servant throughout, my childhood. And right before I was graduating from Penn, I realized I could finally escape. But that realization came a little late. I missed the LSAT, and I needed something to do for a year. And decided that I loved history and I would play with historic documents. But what really propelled me to become an expert was my very first meeting in the field happened to be with Lou Lehrman, who was the perfect person to convince to let me collect for him. And that very first meeting led to the creation of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, based on the collection that the 76,000 documents that I bought for them to start it. And in building that collection, I learned a couple things. And so, buying copies of the Declaration and the Constitution and the Emancipation Proclamation. Lou introduced me to Dick Gilder, and they ended up partnering. And in my very first lunch meeting with Dick Gilder, the first document we talked about was this Lincoln signed copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. And at the end of the meeting, Lou didn't tell me that he had told me that he loved the idea of collecting, but immediately he had in mind building this collection that would become a great educational resource. And this was 35 years ago, so it's before there were millions of documents put online by the National Archives and the Library of Congress and every other place. And he approached Dick to join with him in collecting, and at the end of that first meeting, Lou said to Dick, what do you think? And Dick said, let's do it. And so last year, over 400,000 students used just the Hamilton documents in partnership with the show. Every U.S. AP history student, and just hundreds of thousands of teachers and millions of students have used the documents. And in the course of building that collection, luckily Lincoln signed more than one copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, having sold one, I wanted to sell the next one and the next one. And just began to specialize, focus on these things.
Well, that's amazing. We talked earlier, the America 250 is so important and large, and with your connections as a dealer and all the people that you know and all the documents you're aware of, you could have brought these documents anywhere in the nation, and you decided to partner with the Peoria Riverfront Museum, and as the curator of Promise of Liberty, tell us a little bit about what drove you to bring you here to Peoria.
Yeah, well, as I said last time, the reason I'm here is you guys said yes. Oh. I mean, John and I and Bill Conger met at the America 250 convention in colonial Williamsburg, and I had been buying and selling these historic documents, and most of the ones that I've sell end up in museums. But they weren't being used the way I wanted to see them be used. And I really thought that with the 250th anniversary, it was important not to just look back, but to look forward, and to be able to show these documents in a way that would be worthy of celebration and of bringing people together.
Sure.
And the Peoria Riverfront Museum really stepped up. So I'm delighted with, the space, the partnership, that everybody who's pitched in, because, I had access to the documents. For me, that was the easy part. But putting together an exhibit like this, it was not easy.
Yeah. Well, we are very, very fortunate to have asked and for you to have said yes. So hopefully we continue to ask, and hopefully you continue to say yes.
Sure.
So that's what we would like to see. This section discussion is talking about the long road to liberty and 250 years of civil rights. And the exhibit starts with the Declaration of Independence. And I've heard you say that the Founding Fathers were not delusional, that they knew what they were doing. And so I'm curious, if the Founding Fathers are not delusional, how could they write the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution knowing especially with that one aspirational statement that all men are created equal, but knowing that the social and what we now know as the human rights disparities of the time, how did that work? What were they thinking?
Yeah. Obviously, from our position, there was a great deal of hypocrisy. Mm-hmm. There's cognitive dissonance. But from where they were sitting, they had this idea about liberty. And you can't say, all white men are created equal. It just doesn't have the same ring to it. And so, for me, one of the ways to look at all of American history is through the question of who that sentence applies to. But what they were thinking, it was aspirational. It was an idea of democracy that had never existed before, didn't exist by their saying it. We hold these truths to be self-evident. If they were really so self-evident, you wouldn't even need to say it. But the way we describe it today, the word that we have that they didn't, is it's a manifestation. They're saying it, there are limitations, but they're basing their whole idea of government on inherent natural rights, the French Enlightenment ideas and inherent natural rights. And if that is the basis, then as time goes on, as progress happens, as science goes on, and you see that the roles that had been assigned to different types of people at that period aren't the only roles, and that women and that blacks and that every sort of person deserves to own part of that sentence. Yeah. And to me, the importance of celebrating America 250 wouldn't be the case if some of the other documents that we'll talk about hadn't come along to keep it on track or to put it back on track.
We are in Black History Month, and many of us are aware of the great abolitionist and writer and orator and statesman Frederick Douglass. And I'm curious, what did Frederick Douglass think about the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, he loved the Declaration of Independence, and he hated the idea of the celebration of the Declaration of Independence that was happening in the 1850s. And so he was asked to speak at a July 4th event and said no, said it was totally inappropriate. And so he spoke the next day. And I have a little quote, get my admin working and find the quote. He asked the question, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" I answer, "A day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your national greatness swelling vanity, your denunciations of tyrants' brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery." And I actually calmed it down a little bit by taking out half of his accusations. But even so, he said, "The Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. The principles contained in it are saving principles that we needed to stand by." So even with slavery, he thought of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as documents of freedom, and the country just needed to be changed to actually make them apply to all.
Yeah. So how, given that speech and given the answer and what to the slave is the 4th of July, how, in your opinion or your perspective, how can all Americans participate in the anniversary of the independence, given or despite the long road to liberty? I think one of the things that's really needed today is a return to shared sources of common strength, to shared ideals that we can agree on. And those are the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. The history of the country is not purely a history of following those ideals we know, because even though the exhibition is titled The Promise of Liberty, there's a lot in there about the paradox of liberty, which is that my liberty can come at somebody else's expense. And that's been the story of this country as well. But I think today we need to celebrate it by taking ownership of this idea, we the people of the United States, not the typical answer, everything is corrupt, the system isn't working, burn it all down. Frederick Douglass had that debate with William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was saying, burn it all down, start from scratch. Douglass is the one who said, that never works. And we have the fundamental basis of a nation built on liberty here. This is what we need to make it. And I think the answer is still the same. I want to move towards the importance of Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, because it is so pivotal to who we are as a country. But before we get to the Emancipation Proclamation, there is a very important case and decision in Dred Scott. And I'm curious or wondering, what was the impact of Dred Scott on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution?
Here I would agree with Lincoln, who had a fundamental vision of the Declaration, the Constitution, just as Frederick Douglass did, as those being documents of liberty and this country being based on liberty. And what the Dred Scott decision did was flip that on its head. It totally changed the ideal of the country from being one that would ultimately be of liberty for all to being one that was exclusionary and that was fundamentally built on slavery. The founders, many of the founders thought that slavery would end well before it did. They had good reason to think that. That's the way it seemed to be going. But less than a decade after the Constitution was ratified, the cotton gin was invented. And so that changed the world, and that created a new impetus for slavery. And the initial compromises were all halting the expansion of slavery. But as the economy of cotton and slavery expanded, people who had a stake in it wanted to push slavery further. And that's where it shows up in Illinois as a threat to a free economy and a free country. And Lincoln, I think, was totally right. If you followed the logic of Dred Scott, that a quote, there are no rights that a white man owes to respect for a black man. And this, Dred Scott actually rewrote history by claiming that the founders didn't believe that black men could have a role in government and society and citizenship, when in many places they did. And 5,000 black men fought in George Washington's army for liberty. So they totally rewrote that. It's not just bad law, but bad history, which you often need when you're trying to create bad law. But that inspired Lincoln to get back into politics. He had given this one speech in 1854 in Peoria, and in the exhibit we have from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library the letter inviting Lincoln to Peoria, where he gave a speech and put slavery in context. But even then, it wasn't the biggest thing on his mind. He had actually retired from politics. 3 years later, when the Dred Scott decision came out, he knew that if that had been allowed to stand, that would just totally overturn the idea of the United States of America. And, you know, I wouldn't be here celebrating the Declaration of Independence because it wouldn't mean anything if that's the way the country went.
So there's a question that sometimes permeates, which is, did Lincoln really want to end slavery, or was there some other motive behind the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I know exactly where it comes from. And people who want to say that he really didn't want to end slavery and did it because he had to, they base that on a letter that's also in the exhibit, his letter to Horace Greeley, where he says, if my primary goal is to save the Union, if I could save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, I would. But if I could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that. And so people take that to signify his ambivalence. But it wasn't ambivalent. Actually, the thing to know is that he had already written the Emancipation Proclamation, and he knew it was necessary. And the only reason it hadn't been issued is that his cabinet said, we have to wait for a victory or it'll look like an act of desperation. So as soon as they had their first, what they could call a victory, at the Battle of Antietam, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation because he knew that without the end of slavery, he believed his saying, a house divided cannot stand. And he believed what Stephen Douglas was pretending wasn't the case, which is that Dred Scott really did allow slavery everywhere ultimately, or would if you followed that through its logical extension. And that wouldn't be the America that he believed in.
Sure.
That wouldn't be the Union worth saving. Sure. And he thought, not just for us, but for all mankind, that nation built on liberty needed to be saved.
I've heard you say before, in all of what is happening, that maybe, and you can clarify this for me, is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution both considered, in your opinion, an operating system or technology, or is it one or the other? Help us understand, because that was a very enlightening thought about the idea of technology being a piece of paper.
I will. I'd love to do that. I'm looking at the image that you're seeing up there, and I realize there's something I just want to say
Sure.
about the Emancipation Proclamation first. And the second paragraph here, the first one talks about freeing slaves in Confederate-held areas. Mm-hmm. The second is actually the most revolutionary part of the document. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. Mm-hmm. That is anybody's simplest answer to Dred Scott. Mm-hmm. Dred Scott is actually making the claim that that slaves not only can't be citizens, but in fact really aren't worthy of human rights. And the most important human right is the right of defending your own body, of owning your own body and defending it. And Lincoln is sneaking that into the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's just worth taking a look at, because it's often criticized as being poor writing if you look at the first paragraph that we don't blow up, which is all just a list of areas that it doesn't apply to, areas that the Union actually controls. That's Lincoln doing what he does best, which is very carefully threading a needle, because no matter how righteous you are, if the Supreme Court can strike it down and you give them any reason to, they will. And so he was writing it purely as a military order, purely affecting Confederate-held areas, so that the court could not strike it down. Anyway, the Constitution, sorry.
I know, I'm glad that you brought that up, so thank you, because we did have that conversation. But yeah, the Constitution and it being an operating system, share more on that.
Yeah, so the Declaration of Independence is sort of our mission statement. Mm-hmm. The Constitution, and we're celebrating the beginning of the country, the 250th anniversary, even though in 1776 we don't actually have a government. John Hancock's cover letter sending out the Constitution calls it the ground and foundation of a future government. So the first government is under the Articles of Confederation, and it doesn't work, and people get together and create this Constitution. I have a couple of reasons for wanting to call it technology. And when you use that word, remember it's not just gadgets, but technology is actually a system of organizing knowledge to solve problems. And that literally is what the Constitution is doing. It's organizing a system. It's not creating the whole government. Actually, that Congress has to get together once it's ratified and build and create the departments that the Constitution lays out, and then write the laws. That this is just the outline, the basic operating system. And I contrast this to the idea of that many people have of so-called originalism, which is that we can only today interpret the Constitution by putting ourselves in the shoes and the wigs of these men from 1787. And that's not what they're doing, because they're talking about creating a system based on the situation and circumstances. And in the cover letter to the Constitution, which is on the left side, the bottom left, which would be page 4 of the original document. It's a 4-page newspaper folded in half. So if you open it as we do now, you see "We the people of the United States" on the right and the cover letter on the left. And the cover letter talks about compromises that were necessary. And also something even today, the words, in order to preserve liberty, you have to give up a share of liberty. It's one of the reasons why I call the Constitution a declaration of interdependence. not just with the states, but with people and the state, because nobody has liberty on their own without being in a society that has rules and trade-offs and the consideration of other people. And Lincoln understood the Constitution had the ability to rule for people 100 years later. And we should have the same understanding that, it actually still works. Very few changes had to be made. We'll talk about some of them that are part of this in the Reconstruction amendments. But it works as the operating system. We just have to change the laws. But most importantly, I think we need to think about it not from this originalism point of view, which would be like method acting, but more like an improv point of view. Everything sucks. And, yes, and, when my kids tell me, the system's broken and both parties are corrupt and all this, yes, and, because we still have this Constitution, thankfully, we need to keep it by getting people involved. And another reason that I just like talking about it as technology is that I hope that people can figure out how to play with it better. So
upgrade the operating system.
Exactly.
Learn it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, and you thinking of it as an operating system, you had mentioned the Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, and the 19th amendments as well. That was so pivotal to the civil rights movement and how we began to look at the nation. How did those amendments reform our nation?
Yeah. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment calls for equal protection under the law. And not even just for the federal government, but giving people rights against their states, which is something that really hadn't been thought of before. The 15th Amendment was proposed to give the right of voting to all, so not just black men, but women as well. That wasn't going to pass. And there was this great debate, and hardline supporters of women's suffrage said, well, we have to hold off then. Wait until they pass together because it'll be harder to pass women's suffrage without. And this led to, there had been almost the Venn diagram of women's suffrage and anti-slavery groups was almost a circle. Until then, when they broke apart, and Frederick Douglass had, I think, a perfect answer then, which was, he was very much in favor of women's suffrage, but he said the right to vote for black men was a matter of life or death, and they could not survive without having that right. So he helped get the 15th Amendment passed, just giving the right to vote to black men at that point. And what those did is they refounded the country. So I don't like to think about the founding period as just 1776 or 1787, because without the Reconstruction amendments and without women's suffrage, this wouldn't be the United States of America that we have today. And when we talk about the Constitution, we don't live under the Constitution of 1787. We live under the Constitution that includes those Reconstruction amendments. And not just because of space, but because I like the idea, we put the women's suffrage material in our exhibit gallery with Reconstruction, as opposed to later when it actually happened, but in the 1860s when it could have happened or should have happened.
I want to go, you mentioned the exhibit and the women's suffrage portion of it. Before that, though, there is a sketch of Charles White's The Contribution of the Negro to Democracy in America. And it's such a powerful piece. The original, of course, was commissioned in World War II and sits on the wall at the HBCU, Hampton University in Clark Hall. But I'm wondering, how does this piece, this powerful piece, support your vision of the promise of liberty as the curator?
First of all, there are so many connections to items in the exhibit, from Crispus Attucks, who's also in the Paul Revere Boston Massacre print, to, of course, Frederick Douglass, who's one of the commanding figures in the exhibit, to Sojourner Truth, and so many others who we didn't have room for in the exhibit. But I was able to acquire it after seeing and bidding on a copy of Loitzy's Washington Crossing the Delaware, and I realized that was one way of portraying American history and teaching American history that held sway for over 100 years. And Charles White is saying, not that didn't happen and that Washington didn't cross the Delaware, but that we were here too, that the African Americans were part of the story from the very beginning. And to me, that's a very compelling case to make. It's a few years ago, as an event, and one of the speakers before me at Bunker Hill was actually, I think, trying to be kind of parochial and saying to a very diverse crowd, after he gave a great speech, he put it down and said, "There's one more thing I have to tell you, and it's, remember, you cannot change history." And I got to speak afterwards and said, you couldn't be more wrong. It's our job to change history, because history is understanding. It's what we know. It's how we interpret. It's what we take from the past. You can't change the past, but we have to change history. And Charles White does a great job starting to change history and point out, that it was much more than the founding fathers that we know. And I also think of Abraham Lincoln as a founding father, and Frederick Douglass, and Susan Anthony, and Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. So I think it's appropriate to celebrate all of these people as founding fathers or mothers or founders of the United States of America that we have today.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful piece, and it speaks so powerfully, and I really appreciate that it is in the exhibit. And then where it is in the exhibit, as you start to turn the corner, you see this wonderful picture of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington, and which is showing currently. And you start with the Declaration of Independence. You end with Dr. Martin Luther King's March on Washington speech. Help us understand, how does the civil rights connect with the founding of our nation, and what does it mean today?
Without the civil rights movement succeeding to the extent that it did, we don't have a country that I would be celebrating today. We don't have the United States of America that we should have. So it's there in part because it answers the big question, and why I put this whole exhibit together is, why should we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence? Why should everybody come together and celebrate it, even if they weren't covered by it back then, maybe? And the best answer that I found was in Martin Luther King's speech, where he called it a promissory note, the Declaration and the Constitution. And if you think of it that way, that is what we should consider, instead of focusing on the hypocrisy of the founding, which we don't want to forget. We're not, going to whitewash the paradox of liberty and everything that was not free, but the aspiration of liberty is what Frederick Douglass took, and Lincoln took, and MLK took, to bring us back to the thing that is most worth saving. And in line with the motto of this museum of letting every person grow to the greatest extent and be the best that they can be, well, we're talking about creating a political system that allows that is based on that is based on, inherent human value, creating the greatest for themselves, for ourselves, and for our society altogether, as opposed to being subjects. This is where we are citizens and not subjects of a king or a tyrant. And MLK, got that beautifully. And if you read the speech, then you might want to come and yell at me for saying, you say this is the speech from the March on Washington. I don't see I Have a Dream. Well, he was supposed to give a 5-minute speech. This is the 5-minute speech. This was printed between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. on the morning before the speech, and it was given out to the press. I think one reason that it's so scarce today, they must have made thousands. There were fewer than 20 copies known. Because it didn't have the I Have a Dream. He's just before the last paragraph, when Mahalia Jackson calls out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize this until the last time I was here talking to somebody about it. Like, how did she know to get just at that right point? Mm-hmm. She must have had one of these. But anyway, he goes and talks about the dream for 8 minutes and then comes back and finishes with the paragraph that he had originally intended to finish with about free at last, thank God Almighty we are free at last. So when I celebrate the Declaration of Independence, I celebrate it because of that vision that Dr. King, continued and helped bring us towards. And God knows we still have a lot of way to go. And it could have happened earlier. We just sort of glossed over Reconstruction, but there was a possibility that our country would have been fundamentally changed much more than it did in the 1860s and 70s. And then the violence and racist backlash of the KKK and all ended that, where black voting in areas in the South was 0%, and in some areas it went up to 90% within a few years of the 15th Amendment, and then went back down to very close to 0%. And so that's a question of, we celebrate democracy, but we really don't have a democracy until everybody can participate. A real, true, full democracy. We have democracy to an extent, but imagine, how great this country actually could be if everybody really were included. Yeah.
On the screen is the late, great John Lewis, and you actually have a story. You got to watch him accept a very important medal. And also were able to connect with John Lewis. Can you tell that story?
Yeah. I was at University of Pennsylvania at a time when race relations were not ideal, shall we say. And Minister Louis Farrakhan and some of his acolytes were coming to campus and speaking and drawing thousands of people and leaving our society at Penn worse off, I think. And a couple of friends of mine who later joined 100 Black Men and I created this group to try to have more positive voices come. And I was interning for Congressman Bill Gray, and Congressman Gray suggested John Lewis might be willing to come and talk at Penn. And he did. So he was our first speaker, and I got to know him a little bit then, and then saw him a few times afterwards when I had a gallery and he came and did book signings, and then I saw him the last time was at the National Constitution Center when he very deservedly won the Liberty Medal. Yeah.
It's a great picture, and love the inscription in the book.
Keep your eyes on the prize.
Yeah, keep your eyes on the prize. It's always there. Speaking of prize, we've had a conversation before, and you had mentioned that MLK at one point had reportedly said that Jackie Robinson was the founder of civil rights, and you brought us a prize to add to the exhibit. You want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and because Aaron brought it up in our first conversation, I'm like, if I'm going to come out here to the museum again, what can I come that's special? So what you're looking at is a picture of Jackie Robinson on his first day playing as a Dodger, and the April 15th, 1947 UPI, I think it is, news report about what he did. I couldn't bring that because it's on display at a exhibit called Game Changers, How Sports Brings Us Together, at the George Bush Presidential Center. So I brought, and you'll see it outside, Jackie Robinson's actual signed contract for 1949, which was his best year. He was MVP of the league. And it's cool, the Library of Congress has a copy that's signed by Branch Rickey, but not signed by Jackie Robinson. And the salary offered was $14,000, which was an awful lot of money. I think that would have still been top 10. Robinson didn't sign it, and then a week later they agreed to the contract that you see right outside here, where he's being paid $21,000, and that he signs. Because you made me think about it and brought it up, we are going to find a place for it in the exhibit.
May I continue to bring stuff up?
Yeah. I think every time I come out here for a different talk, the idea is to bring something new.
Yeah, I'll put my thinking cap on.
Yeah.
We'll keep generating. But you had said something very interesting about Jackie Robinson and his goal, really, around the idea of not just playing baseball, but something bigger, broader, as far as access to, for Black Americans. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah. So there's a questionnaire that he filled out in 1946 when he shows up at spring training for the Montreal Royals, which is still big league, but it's the farm team. It's Major League Baseball, but it's the minor league team of Major League Baseball. And the league hires a Chicago PR outfit who needs to know who the new players are. So they put together a one-page questionnaire that every new player filled out. And most of it is normal stuff. What are your sports other than baseball, golf, favorite activities, Boys and Girls Club, where you live, et cetera. But when it comes to ambition in baseball, all the others that I've seen are, to get to the World Series or to be the best second baseman or to play for the Giants. And his was to open doors for Negroes in organized ball. So he knew exactly what he was doing there. And he did that, and then circling around to why he was so instrumental to civil rights is by doing that, he opened many people's hearts and minds to the idea of integration, to the idea of building, a stronger country together by including rather than excluding. And that's where sports, that's where any kind of, that's where an exhibit hopefully can open people's minds and get people to be thinking positively. And so I'm very happy to bring that document here because it continues what he started to do with that, what he wanted to do, as he said in that questionnaire.
Sure. And with this, on April 15th, Jackie Robinson Day, when all of baseball is wearing 42, we will think about the Peoria Riverfront Museum and what we have, thanks to your generosity. So thank you so much. We appreciate, this has been such a great conversation. I probably could ask 7, 8, 10 more questions. and pick your brain. I know we're at time. And I believe you're going to be around at the end for if anyone has questions. Or
I'm going to go up to the exhibit area and invite people to come and see the exhibit, and then ask all you want.
So Seth is going to be in the exhibit, and we ask all of you to please, if you have not had the opportunity to go visit the exhibit, please do. In addition to that, there's also, after the exhibit, there's Bronzeville to Harlem, there's Joyful Resistance, so fantastic exhibits, and we just, again, thank you so much, and thanks to the Peoria Riverfront Museum, and I will hand it off to Everly.
Can we give them a round of applause?